Thank you, Dr. Jarrell, and thank you to everyone for being here. I'm honored to be sharing this stage with my wonderful colleagues across campus. A few years ago, I was sitting in the back of a packed auditorium where a scientific conference plenary was being held. There was frenetic energy and excitement in the air. More than 200 attendees had just finished lunch and gotten their second, or perhaps their third or fourth fill of coffee. Packed in the hall were academics, researchers, students, and health professionals, many like us, committed to better understanding how we can improve health for all people. We sat and listened to a talk about babies exposed to harmful substances during pregnancy. At the end of one of the keynotes, all of us in the room heard a speaker very confidently assert that their study found that Black babies experienced less pain than white babies, as evidenced, so we were told, by the lower exposure of Black babies to pain medication for quote-unquote withdrawal. I sat in my seat and pondered these closing remarks. I thought about whether their conclusion reflected the evidence they shared or not. I am an epidemiologist after all, and our work is concerned with determining the truth of the relationship between a hypothesized cause and effect. I was curious about whether the evidence here matched the conclusion. I waited anxiously for the Q&A in the hopes that someone else would inquire further. Alas, when we neared the end of the apportioned time, I realized that the responsibility to speak up would fall on me. I nervously wrote down precisely what I wanted to say to ensure that I did not misspeak. I say nervously because this was a conference full of my peers, many more senior than me, including the speaker making the claim. I raised my hand. After being asked to speak, I said, "Thank you for your important research. I'd like to ask why it is that the conclusion was that Black babies experienced less pain and not rather that Black babies are undertreated for pain, something we know to be true. The former suggests a kind of biological essentialism, in this case, a misguided belief that Black babies are somehow genetically and physiologically different from white babies to the extent that they don't experience pain in the same way. And the latter names racism as the driver of low-quality healthcare provision in this hyper-vulnerable clinical population." The speaker genuinely appeared puzzled and responded that they hadn't thought of that explanation and promised to look into it further. After the talk, a crowd of attendees thanked me for my intervention. One person I vividly recall said, "I knew that sounded wrong, and I'd thought the same thing as you, but couldn't bring myself to speak up." I realized at that moment that I spoke for so many in the room, even if it meant that I spoke up alone. I wondered, too, what it would have meant for a room full of scientists, researchers, and healthcare professionals ostensibly deploying the scientific method in their own work to have let that false assertion go on unchecked. I know many of us here are familiar with the scientific method, the revered systematic process by which we gain knowledge to better understand the world around us and to better arrive at the truth of who we are. This method, foundationally developed by the Arab scholar Ibn al-Haytham, was intended not just as a pathway to accumulate knowledge for knowledge's sake, but to critically evaluate the ways in which we actually conduct research and to be clear about the ends our research serves. This mission includes interrogating our own positions as researchers to ensure that we, as the evidence shapers, quote, avoid falling into prejudice or leniency. I share this story then not to criticize the work of others, but rather to point out that the scientific method alone is insufficient for this moment. The imperative now, as it was in many times past, including in that packed auditorium, is to couple that revered method with the courage to speak up, even and perhaps especially so when it makes us uncomfortable, unpopular, or in some cases, vulnerable. I recall here a famous Arab proverb, لا تستوحش طريق الحق لقلة السائرين فيه, which roughly translates to, fear not the path of truth for lack of people walking on it. In this spirit, I would argue that courage, a muscle that requires regular exercise, is in fact part and parcel of the scientific method. That is to say, if the scientific method is the mind guiding science, courage, both individual and collective, is the essential heartbeat. Why is it then that there was so much silence in that auditorium? Even when it was clear that so many people found the conclusion discordant with the evidence that we shared and the evidence that we know about healthcare practices towards our most vulnerable patients. Whether it's the decimation of our already fractured social safety nets, or the increasing inability for people to find adequate food or jobs with wages that allow them to live, survive, and thrive, or the targeting of universities physically, financially, and existentially, why is it that, with some very obvious exceptions, there is so much silence now? Even in this moment of great suffering at the micro and macro scale, locally, nationally, and globally, why is the silence so loud? I think the complete answer to these questions cannot be contained in one short speech, but two reasons are worth mentioning here. For one, people don't like to be seen. They'd prefer to remain in their labs and melt into the wallpaper, as it were. Research finds the bystander effect a very powerful force in determining how people behave in challenging social contexts, arguing that due in part to a perceived diffusion in responsibility, people have a reduced likelihood to speak up and to intervene to mitigate harm when others are around them. The second is that people fear social and professional consequences for speaking up, even when their conscience and moral compass compel them to. These consequences include professional isolation, loss of livelihoods, and feelings of deep loneliness. These are real, and I do not want to diminish from them. But while these are compelling reasons, even more so when taking into account power and class asymmetries, they ignore a fundamental truth. That is that silence is also a form of speech. And when we are silent about the things that matter, we are saying something very powerful and very loud about where we stand about the things that matter. Silence thus indicates a clear position. As the late historian Howard Zinn famously noted, and this is a thought that has always stayed with me, when everything around you is propelled by kinetic energy, Zinn says, you cannot be neutral on a moving train. Not only is Zinn telling us that we cannot be neutral on a moving train, but he is reminding us that none of us are passive spectators on this train in a world moving towards greater and greater uncertainty. Because if we don't speak up, who will? Who and what fills the void when silence becomes the message? If we don't speak up, who will model courage for our students who look to us in these moments of great precarity, not only for our voices, but for our support of theirs? Universities, especially public universities like ours, that have been the primary engines for promoting social and economic mobility, have always been on that moving train Zinn warned us about. And we, the faculty, are also its passengers. Though it may be comforting to think otherwise, we are not bystanders on the platform of a proverbial station, waiting for a moment for us to board. We are aboard, and this is the moment. If the university, including our own, is to thrive and is to remain a trusted site for fostering those most human of endeavors, of seeking knowledge, of acting upon that knowledge, and of upending ways of knowing. In short, if the university is to remain a site where the integrity and rigor of science is taken seriously, then it must continue to be a space for the flourishing of free inquiry, deliberation, conversation, and of the freedom to explore in a collaborative environment unfettered by a mind-numbing mandate to remain inside the comfort zone of the powers that be. And we, the faculty who have dedicated our lives to improving this world we live in, have to have the courage to speak up in defense of these values. In fact, it is our collective responsibility to do so, as a community and as a university. Indeed, the more of us who walk the path of truth, the more we can share in the burden of eliminating that path for others. Thank you.